Most people have this view that the advertising firms, the owners aren't really in the cases very much, which sounds like it's very different for you. But, as you said, it's very competitive. Advertising is expensive. It is a long game you got to play. You don't just throw a couple commercials up and get cases. You got to be out there for a good long time for it to actually work. But for those lawyers out there that can't afford advertising, it sounds like you still get a lot of referrals. I mean, what sort of advice would you give to them to generate cases, referrals, cultivate the relationships, those sorts of things?
So I'll say two things. One, just being on the advertising lawyer. I've had people that come to me, or they want advice, but like the mindset becomes, hey, I turn on the commercial and, my staff will take care of it and I'll go golfing. When you start advertising, if you're actually doing it right, you're actually going to be working more, not less.
Welcome to the Founding Partner Podcast. Join your host, Jonathan Hawkins, as we explore the fascinating stories of successful law firm founders. We'll uncover their beginnings, triumph over challenges, and practice growth. Whether you aspire to launch your own firm, have an entrepreneurial spirit, or are just curious about the legal business, you're in the right place. Let's dive in.
Welcome to Founding Partner Podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Hawkins. This is a podcast where I get to interview law firm founders, successful law firm founders that have done all kinds of cool stuff. And today is no exception. Today, I get to interview a very successful and apparently up in Chicago, very well known. I'm not in Chicago, but I hear everybody knows this guest. So today, happy to welcome Howard Ankin. Howard, thanks for coming on. Why don't you tell us, a little bit about you, a little bit about your firm and your practice?
Well, thanks for having me. That's a very nice introduction, Jonathan. I'm a third-generation lawyer, a little bit different third generation than most. It was my dad's father that was a lawyer, and then my mom married a lawyer. So I guess then the only thing that my mom knew was for her firstborn son that I was going to be a lawyer too. So I'm here in Chicago, Illinois, and my office is located, if you put a bullseye right in the center of what we call our Chicago Loop, or Chicago downtown. That's where my office is at 10 North Dearborn. And I practice personal injury law in all facets, anything that's contingency fee related. I do workers' compensation, personal injury, medical malpractice, products liability, trucking, slip and fall, dog bites. So Social Security disability, mass torts. So anything that's contingency fee related in the injury field, that's what we do here.
And so for people like me that aren't from Chicago, my understanding is you're an advertiser, or at least that's part of your marketing mix. And so, like I said, a lot of people know who you are. Is that right?
Well, I grew up in the Chicagoland area. I went to law school. I went to undergrad at the University of Illinois. I went to law school here in the Chicago Loop. So I hope I was a hometown guy to begin with. But then, like most lawyers, as their career advances, you want to get your reputation out. And in a city over 10 million people, I used to think as a younger lawyer, I had all these jury verdicts and I was doing all this great stuff and I was working 15 hours a day and working late into the night. And I thought like the name was going to get out there, but you find unless you have some type of way to be on a podcast or, do some type of marketing, it's very hard for that name recognition to get out there. So, so then I started marketing and advertising my practice.
So I do want to get into some of that a little later, but first I want to circle back. So third generation lawyer. So was it your destiny? I mean, was this something you knew growing up? Is it your parents were saying, hey, you're going to be a lawyer, or is it something you just wanted to do, or was it's just there wasn't anything else you could think of to do?
Well, I didn't know what type of lawyer I was going to be, but in my world with my maternal grandfather being a lawyer and my father being a lawyer, I really didn't know anything else. Like from the beginning of time, I just thought that I would be a lawyer because that's what you're supposed to do. So like in the community that I grew up in, there was a lot of, like if you came from a certain background, there's a lot of people that own Dunkin' Donuts. There's other, backgrounds, people if they, they owned, cleaners, that kind of stuff. Like in the world that I was in, I was a lawyer. That was like that's what the people in my background did.
My dad was a lawyer, so I'm a second generation.
Yeah.
And, I sort of wanted to do my own thing. I wanted to not be a lawyer, but I tell this story before. But so I was at undergrad. I went engineering undergrad, and I did not want to be an engineer either. So I went to the career services, and I did all these assessments and took all these tests. And it gave me the top 10 careers that I was best suited for. And I think 5 of the 10 were some sort of lawyer. So, so for me, it was almost like destiny.
Yeah. I worked at a summer job like most people. So I worked trading in an options pit over the summer between my junior and senior year. And it was my job to run around and check the trades. And then, sometimes like I'd have to come in on a Saturday morning and it was triple witching hour. I had to make sure that all the trades cleared and whatever. So at the end of the summer, the group that I work for, they said, look, you're doing a great job here. We like you. Why don't you finish up your third year of your last year of college? You'll finish it up here. You'll train you more and you can come start, being a trader. And at that time, trading options was that's where some big money was made. So I remember coming home and I said to my mom, I'm like, I'm thinking maybe this law school thing might not work for me. I'm going to be a trader. She said, you're going back to college, going to law school, and then you can decide what you want to do with your life after that.
There you go. Yeah. Yeah. So your firm now, take me back to before that. So, your granddad, your dad were lawyers. Did you go work with them immediately after law school, or did you do something else?
So I have a much different path for a generational law firm path. My grandfather had a real estate practice, and it really had nothing to do with anything that I'm doing today, and nothing to do with my dad's practice. My dad was functionally a criminal defense lawyer, but he also had, for many lawyers of his generation, he was a general practice lawyer. So he did some real estate closings too, or general type civil lawsuits and that kind of stuff, with his focus more on the criminal law. So for me, I followed the path that most people I did. I went to law school. I worked for a law firm while I was in law school, and then went out. On graduation, I worked for a law firm for a year. Then I worked for another law firm for about 4 years. And then I had to make a decision about 5 years in which way I was going to go. So I probably jumped too early at that time, but it worked out for me. And I started my own law practice, independent of my dad or independent of anybody else. And then later over time, then my father and I merged together and we worked together, but really he still kind of did the type of law that he did and I did the law that I did, but it was under one roof of what we now call Ankin Law.
So take me back to when you started your firm. I mean, you did have the benefit of growing up in a lawyer family, and I assume your dad had his own practice. So was this something that you just sort of always sort of knew you were going to do, or something else when you started your practice?
Yeah, I mean, I was hungry. I still relish being a lawyer, and I still have a strong passion for being a lawyer today. And I still have a strong passion for what I'm doing now and for goals that I want to have today. But especially, taking it back 35 years ago, I was hungry to have my own law practice and be a successful lawyer. So I was trying a lot of cases as a young lawyer, working at the firms that I was at. I was working all kinds of hours. I remember my dad having a conversation with me where I was calling him one night at 10 o'clock at night from the office. And he's like, you're trying to sprint a marathon. And, maybe at the time I was. But anyway, so I started my own law practice. I had accumulated about 40 personal clients or referrals that were personally referred to me over time. So when I left my old law firm, I had about 40 cases that I started with. And I took various resources that I knew, and I was calling everybody I knew, and I told them that I was starting my own law practice. And at the beginning, even though, injury work is what I did, my dad was a general practice lawyer, and it put me through law school. So I started doing general practice work for, I'd probably say, the first 5 years of my practice. So people had a phone, they had a lawyer, and I was doing some criminal defense work. I was doing real estate closings. I was doing bill by the hour, lawsuits, whatever it took. But I was building up my practice. And about the time that I was 30 years old, then I, hit my first big case. And, from there, then it kind of went off to the races from at that point.
So yeah, I was going to ask, when did it change from the general practice, I'll call it, to really focusing on the personal injury practice? Was it after you hit that case, you had enough resources that you could focus, or was it something different?
Looking back, I wish I would have had a little bit more faith and confidence in myself. And I'm still always worried about the success of my practice. With the summer now, we have a lot of summer clerks here. So we have about 110 people that are in my office working at this point. But in general, I average about 100 people with me helping people. So I probably should add a little bit more confidence in myself that it was going to work out. But for a long time, I was always worried about like when I was going to get the next case, or if I was ever going to get the next case, or, in the personal injury field, there's a lot of costs. So you always have a lot of costs outlay. And if you're on a contingency fee, meaning a percentage of the recovery, so if the case doesn't work out. So, even today, I'm always as good as, what I did yesterday, but especially younger, I was always concerned about that. So anyways, I eventually had a case where, this goes back several years, but at that time I had about $50,000 in experts on the case, which was a significant amount of money for me. And it was one of these cases where there was no offer until you were showing up to the final pretrial right before picking the jury. So the judge comes out and basically says to the defense, are you offering anything or you're not offering anything? And the defense is hemming and hawing. The judge's like, I don't have time for this. Let's go pick the jury. Okay. And he says, Mr. Ankin, you got a demand on the file? I'm like, Your Honor, not only do we have a demand, but we got a demand, and we also got we got basically like, we call it like a penalties petition, where like if we got a verdict over the policy limits, we'd have an opportunity to get money beyond the policy limits. So I had about 50 grand at stake. And if this case didn't go right, I was probably going to have to wrap it all up and go start working for somebody else. I didn't know what was going to happen. But anyways, at that moment, we're in the judge's chamber. The defense said, we're going to pay the policy limits on this case. And anyways, from there, it was a significant sum. And like I had that matter, and then I had another matter that kind of resolved itself in the similar time frame. And those two cases was kind of like, it was a definite shift in my life that made all the difference. So,
it's funny, hearing your story. I mean, I've had mine, and talking to others, it's like you're sort of clawing and scraping, and all of a sudden, boom, this moment hits, and then you're like, this is going to work. And then you're like, we're going for it. So your firm now, you got a lot of people, 100 people plus, that's a lot of people. So maybe take me through a little bit sort of the evolution. So when you first went out, you had some cases, that's good. Was it just you? When did you start adding help? And maybe take me through sort of the jumps you made along the way. I mean, you don't go from 1 to 100 overnight.
Yeah, it wasn't pretty, I will tell you that. I started in an office, and until this case that I'm talking about happened, my desk was a card table and a card table chair that had my computer on it. That was how fancy it was. And then when this case happened, I went out and bought a desk and got office furniture and all that kind of stuff. But it didn't start. It started with very meager means. And really what happened is, like, first employee, all they did was answer the phone. Then I had somebody that answered the phone, and then I had, it was like I used to work all week, and then I used to, like, anything that was like secretarial, support staff stuff, all those files would get put like on the side. And then like that was my homework for Saturday and Sunday, because I was doing like the legal work during the week, but it was like weekends or at nights. That's when I changed my hat from being a lawyer to a legal assistant. And then I would do it that way. It's funny today, but like we file complaints, or the money that has to go into a legal case, like I just sign checks all day long in my firm now. And I don't know that the younger lawyers even appreciate this, but there was a period of time where I'd be like, okay, well, I'm going to put this case in, this is the statute on this one, and this is what's happening with this case. I'm going to put this case into suit next week. And then like, I'll put this case into suit the following week. Because, if I had to put up $500 or $1,000 per case, it was like, I almost had to like leg into it. I couldn't put like all 6 cases into suit on the same day. So, it's just like the difference. But anyway, so I got a phone receptionist, then a legal assistant, then another legal assistant. And after a while, like I got my first attorney that came to work for me, and a second attorney, and a third attorney, and it kind of molded on from there. But for a long time, it was like me and 10 legal assistants. And they just put all the paperwork together and told me where to be. And I'd be bopping around from like one courtroom to the next. And I'd be like with my hair on fire. And, my main legal assistant at the time, I'd come in and I'd be like, did the phone ring? And she's like, it's been pretty quiet. And I don't know, I'd sit down at my desk, I make calls. And, she said to me one day, she's like, whenever you're around, the phone's ringing off the hook. And I'm like, I got it. So even though I got 100 people today, I feel like I need to be around to, make make the room spin around.
The card table story, it reminds me, read about Jeff Bezos, and when he started, I think they couldn't afford desks, so they went to Home Depot and just bought doors and just stood them up. So their desks were literally doors from Home Depot because it's a little cheaper.
I guess I was ahead of Jeff Bezos with the card table chair, but he, obviously I didn't think it through that well. I should have done it a little differently.
So you said at some point your dad joined you. So, I'm always interested, my dad was a lawyer. Like I said, I've never practiced with him. We're in two different cities, but what was that like having your dad come on? I mean, it's sort of like full circle. It sounds like you'd been running your firm for a while and you're like, all right, come join me. And maybe what was that like? And what's it like working with your dad?
So actually what happened is it was like we moved into an office together when this happened. And I was on like this corner of a small office, and my dad had an office on the opposite end of the other corner. And a buddy of his came in that rented space, and we were so concerned about the rent that we actually gave his buddy the best primary office in the suite. And my dad and I had like what would be like the two associate offices. And he did his work on his end, and I did my work on my end. And we started to be like, okay, I'm going to refer you this case, and you'll refer me this case. And it just got to be such back and forth between like, I'm referring you this and I'm referring you that, and keeping track of it. And we just are like, we just like merged it together in terms of like one office. But my dad continued to always do the type of work that he did, and I continued to do the type of work that we had. And he kind of like continued to like, greatest thing about being a lawyer is 100,000 lawyers plus in the state of Illinois, and everybody could be a lawyer how they want to practice law. So my dad kind of continued to practice law he wanted, and I continued to move forward and practice the vision of law of how I wanted to. But it was great being in the office with my dad. We had lunch together, so on and so forth. I don't know that we practiced that much together, but just being able to be around my dad was great.
So are there any Ankins that are going to be the fourth generation lawyer?
That is, Jonathan, the $1 million question. Proud that my son just graduated from high school. My daughter just finished up her freshman year of high school. So I got started late. There's about 10 years of my life that are unaccounted for. I celebrated my 40th birthday when my son had his 6-month birthday. So it shows you what happens when you become a lawyer. So we'll see. I got to keep doing what I'm doing for the next 10 years, whether I like it or not. We'll see if they want to be lawyers. Maybe they'll have a significant other one of them that they may want to do something. So we'll see how it goes. Otherwise, I got a lot of lawyers that are partners and a lot of people that will be partners that work with me. And I know that they have their hopes and dreams for their family. So I'm pretty hopeful that the Ankin Law label will be around for at least another generation or two, providing the good services that we do.
So let's talk, and I want to get into that too, but the growth of your firm, and I sort of feel like I could be wrong here, but my sense is from my own experience and talking to lots of people, it's, growth or real growth is really not accidental. I think you sort of have to make a decision. At some point you have to decide, am I going to take the risk, hire the extra people, and really go? I mean, on some level, when it was just you probably got busy enough and you're like, I just need some help. So, but once you get to that level, you sort of, I think, have to make a decision. So was there a point in your career where you said, all right, I'm going to grow this baby
I'll answer that to you, Jonathan, I'll answer that to you two ways. I got two answers for that. First answer. What was really happening to me is it was me and I had, I don't know, 10, 12 legal assistants, and I had like maybe, one lawyer, maybe two that were helping me at a certain point. And I used to get a lot of referrals from other lawyers. Like I'd walk up and down like the main street of the Chicago Loop by the courthouse, and lawyers that didn't want to try cases, like they may settle them, but if they didn't settle, they needed somebody to go to court and try the case. So I got a lot of referrals from lawyers that had difficult cases that they didn't want to try for whatever reason. I had referral sources from other lawyers, and I was pretty content with that law practice, and I probably would have kept going with that. What happened with me was in the 2008 downturn, all of a sudden, all the lawyers that like in the 2000s that had like all types of private equity deals and real estate deals and .com deals and whatever, the world was starting to dry up in that 2008 economy. And I was like looking at myself and I'm like, where's the referrals? But the lawyers that were referring, they were kind of keeping those cases themselves now. So, I didn't set out to be an advertising attorney, but I didn't want to lose the infrastructure that I already had. And I had to keep that volume up. So I started advertising. And what the advertising is, you got to keep feeding the monster, because, once you have 10 people, you got to feed them, and you got to feed 20, and you got to feed 100. So the other aspect of this is there were periods of time in my career in a prior time where I'm like, yeah, 20 people's enough, 50 people's enough. And I can kind of try to run it at like this level. But every time that I got to a point where if you're not growing, you're dying. Okay. And where we're at now in a legal world is I am no longer competing against the law firm across the street or the lawyer that's got a firm in the suburbs. And it doesn't matter if they're here for one generation, they just started, third generation law firm. The competition now is coming out of Florida and Texas and Nevada and New York, California. The firms that we're competing with now are national. And so their war chest, their budgets, their ability to hire the best lawyer talent, so on and so forth, that's what I'm competing against. So, there's always room for another good lawyer. But as far as being a lawyer, you want to work on the best cases that you could work on, and you want to try to find as much success as you have, because for the client wants to know that the lawyer has sustaining power, and the client wants to know that the lawyer has all the resources to bring to task to be the most successful for them. So some clients are like, it's not, what you know, it's who you know. Okay. And there's a lot of like, when it's on a contingency fee, you don't want there to be a lawyer that feels like he's got to settle the case on Friday because he's got to pay the rent. You need sustaining power. So long story short is that issue about growth, especially now, there's national firms that have thousands of lawyers. So if I don't have 100 people, you're not going to bring to bear what the client needs to be successful.
So let's talk about sort of as your firm has grown, maybe how your role in the firm has grown. So you started out as trying cases, getting referrals, trying cases people didn't want to try. And so then you advertise, your volume probably goes up. You're building a business, you got to manage all that. So what do you do now? Do you take an active role in any cases? Are you trying cases still, or is that?
Yes. I still have an active role with a lot of cases. Some people might think that my active role is in the cases that are like the most financially lucrative, but a lot of times it's actually the opposite. So a lot of the cases that I personally get involved with is I may advertise, but I also still get referrals from other lawyers. I still get referrals from people that I, grew up in my hometown, went to high school with. I get referrals from people that know me from my kids' schools, what have you. So a lot of times if somebody calls me and says like, hey, It's my nephew has this problem. I can't really turn that case over to one of my partners or associate attorneys. So a lot of the cases that I handle personally are cases where like people are close to me. And since I'm kind of prolific and out there, I do have I'm lucky to have more than a fair share of people that like want me to help them, and they're kind of expecting that I'm the one that helps them. And I try to do that the best that I can. The other way is on the larger cases, but in all of our cases, even when new cases are coming in, the cost of us to get an expert to like go out and inspect the car when the airbag didn't open, or to check to make sure that like this product was defective or whatever we need to do. We're talking, $10,000, like without blinking an eye. So, we could have cases that our costs are 10,000, but we could have cases that are 50,000 or $500,000 that we need to invest not our time, but hard dollars in. So for my purposes, I want to know what cases we're investing the expert costs on. I want to know who the experts are. I want to know what their expert reports look like, because if it's an expert's case, the case might rise and fall on who the experts are that we have. And for my lawyers, they may be incentivized on the outcome of the case, but I don't have a desensitizing way that if like the lawyer decided that he needed an expert, but then if the case doesn't go right, or like we investigated a case, but then we decided that after investigation it doesn't pan out, these are overhead costs that can severely affect the ability to put food on my table at the end of the day. So I'm involved in that's a big, heavy involvement that I need to be involved in overseeing that.
Mm-hmm.
Also, for me personally, I got to come to work here every day. I invested a good portion of my life in my law practice. So I'm still also involved in interviewing and that type of stuff. I may not do the first interview, but for the most part, many people that work here, I'm involved at some point in that interview process. And I want to know who's working here. And I also want to be involved in, what people are doing here, like our processes, to make sure that the service that we're providing is the same type of service that I feel good about providing.
And for all those owners out there and want to be law firm owners, I mean, it's when you're the owner, you care about it more than anybody else, top to bottom. And that's, like you said, culture, hiring, all that stuff, the investment in the cases. And so that's cool that you're still heavily involved in all that stuff. Most people have this view that the advertising firms, the owners aren't really in the cases very much, which sounds like it's very different for you. But, as you said, it's very competitive. Advertising is expensive. It is a long game you got to play. You don't just throw a couple commercials up and get cases. You got to be out there for a good long time for it to actually work. But for those lawyers out there that can't afford advertising, it sounds like you still get a lot of referrals. I mean, what sort of advice would you give to them to generate cases, referrals, cultivate the relationships, those sorts of things?
So I'll say two things. One, just being on the advertising lawyer. I've had people that come to me, or they want advice, but like the mindset becomes, hey, I turn on the commercial and, my staff will take care of it and I'll go golfing. When you start advertising, if you're actually doing it right, you're actually going to be working more, not less. Why? Because that quality control from the first time that the telephone rings, you have to have strong quality control. You have to have infrastructure to be able to take in those telephone calls. And even if you're not accepting a case, in the world of Google, you're going to get multiple one-star reviews, online when you don't accept the case. So I'm the longest-winded person I know, as you can tell from our podcast today. And the reason for that is because as soon as I don't explain something to somebody in triplicate, they're mad and I'm not eating, because they're just going to go online and hammer me, So you need to have infrastructure that is going to be able to do it, and you need to have infrastructure that's going to provide quality care. Once, if you're a lawyer, which we'll get to in a second, and you're getting referrals from friends and family, and they don't like how the case goes, they may not talk to you again, or they may tell you that like they're not happy with your services, but they may not go to the next step of going online and being like, I hate my next door neighbor. Okay. So, but when you're dealing with the public, everything you do is highly scrutinized, and you're going to end your law career pretty quickly with a bunch of one-star Google reviews. So anyways, advertising equals much more infrastructure and much more oversight to make sure that it's going the right way. The advertising also, at least for me, a lot of times gets you business that you should have been, that I think I should have been getting anyway. What I mean by that, so I have people, they'll call me from high school, Howard, how are you, what have you, okay? Yeah, we were good friends in high school, okay? Or, you know, good school friends, let's say. But I may have not seen or talked to them in 35 years. But with the advertising now, I remind them, and I'm in this world, and they call me because, you know, they do know me, and I can pick up the phone like it's 35 years later and be like, how you doing? So advertising helps in that way. Now, for me, what is the best form of advertising? The advertising for me works when it reinforces what I'm already doing in the community. So like if I'm going out, I do a lot of workers' compensation also, injuries. So if I go out to like a union hall and I'm making a union speech, the people at the union, hopefully they've heard of me because I've been doing work in the union and I've done good work there. But in general, if I go to a new union or go to a new place, they may have heard the name Howard Ankin before. So it's like now they're meeting me in person. So, or somebody says to somebody, hey, I'm referring you to Howard Ankin. In this day and age, everybody wants to like do research. They want to know who their lawyer is. So typically, like if somebody said, hey, you need a dentist, you need an accountant, hey, where do I buy a pair of socks? But everybody's going to go online and be like, hey, are these good socks? You know, they want to do their own research. So you got to be out in the community and doing things. So I'm the president of my law school's alumni association. I'm on the board of managers for the Illinois trial lawyers. I'm on the board of governors of the American Association for Justice. I'm in a section council for the Illinois State Bar Association, for a free service legal group that's across the street from me. I was on their board for several number of years, and I'm still active in the work that they do, and so on and so forth. So I try to give back to the legal community as much as I can, to whatever else I'm involved in, my kids' schools, so on and so forth. I try to be, you know, active in my local community. And then my law firm in general, we try to pick our spots where we could have like the community could see us doing things and doing charity work and giving back. So we do this thing where we have something that's called Teacher of the Month. And we basically, students can write in about a favorite teacher and the great work that the teacher's doing. And then we'll go to the school and the teacher gets an award, and we give $1,000 to the teacher to buy school supplies or whatever they want to give. And then that kind of gets put out there in the ether so that people know that my firm is trying to be part of the community and give back. So these are just, you know, we also have, you know, internet stuff and billboards and TV and radio and those things, but the style in which we advertise those advertisements, I feel that we do that more like from a community sense. We're trying to provide information that would be good for somebody watching those advertisements, more than just like, hey, I got $1 million for this case and look how great I am. Not saying that's not a good advertisement for other people. I'm just saying that's how we distinguish ourselves.
Real quick, thanks for listening. If you're getting any value out of this podcast, please take 2 seconds to hit the subscribe button and leave a 5-star review. It would really mean a lot to me. Now back to the show. And so it sounds to me like, you grew up in a time where relationships matter. You got a lot of referrals. So I imagine, tell me if I'm wrong, but I imagine you stay in touch with your past clients, and maybe talk about a little bit of some of the things you do to do that, to nurture those relationships. So it's not like your case is over, I never talk to you again. I mean, what sorts of things do you do to nurture those relationships and hopefully get referrals from your past clients?
My dad was a sole practitioner in a day when, maybe even more advertising was frowned upon, which is kind of like why it took me a long time to even get into the advertising game. But my dad's prior clients, those were the lifeblood. Those are the people that put me through law school and put the food on the table at our house. So, I grew up watching, my dad answer every telephone call, be concerned about like what was happening in his clients' lives. Like my dad lived a lot of his clients' cases, like where he was as concerned for like what the outcome of the case would be, almost like it was him, So that's how I grew up. So I don't know. There was, what was it, Monday or Tuesday this week? I remember like it was like the end of the day, and I had to get home before my wife yelled at me one more time that I was going to miss dinner with the family. And I remember looking at two things, one that would be more personable to me, and one was this phone call, and I had to make a decision which one I was going to make. And I'm like, well, this is the right one to make, and this is what I'm going to make. So I had a union store, never asked anything of me. He's referred me, a couple cases over the years, always been nice to me, what have you. And he called me and he's like, I've known you a long time and I've never really asked you for anything, but like, my son, he was in the military and, he has this divorce going on in, another state. And it's like, can you just talk to him and give him some advice? And I was like, well, I haven't done much with divorce work in over, 25 years, but, I'm like, so I called him and I talked to him and found out what the problem was. And then I had to called one lawyer and got some advice about what happened. And I had to call another lawyer because that one didn't work, that I got advice about what happened. And then ultimately I'm like, okay, this is what's happening here. There's the lawyer that you need at the price point that you're at or whatever in this other community. And, an hour later, I was home for dinner late, but I got him exactly where he needed to go. And I don't know that he was going to be able, it took me an hour to navigate it for him. There'd be no way that he was going to navigate that in an hour. I don't know that he would have been able to navigate that ever. So anyways, like the world is round and, is this ever going to come back to me? No, but like almost like, his dad asked me to give legal advice to his son and, I owed it to him. And so a lot of the stuff that I do a lot of times, it's, like I say to myself all the time, I can't ask somebody else to do something for me unless I'm willing to do stuff for them. So that's just kind of how I lead my day as far as what do I do every day?
Well, that's a good point. You put good things out into the world. You may not, just to be good, and it's just good energy, whatever you want to call it. And eventually, hopefully some of that comes back your way. But if, it may not be a direct line from this guy, but I guarantee you he's not going to forget what you did for him. He may not realize how much you saved him or how much work you put into it, but he's never going to forget it, I suspect.
Kind of like your podcast, Jonathan. You put it out there for everybody, and everybody, all goodwill comes back to you for helping the world.
Yeah, you never know. You just never know. But so I want to shift real quick. So I want to maybe shift to the business aspect of your firm. So it's way different operating a 100-person firm versus a 1-person firm. So how did you learn it along the way? And, do you have people that help you now? How do you run this big operation?
So along the way, you always meet people and, they give you good advice. You listen to a podcast and you get good advice or whatever. So I remember talking to a lawyer and I was complaining. I was like, it's hard to find lawyers that want to work as hard as me. And, the competition to get to good cases is very competitive, and there's people that are doing, maybe some unsavory things that, I wouldn't want to do to get legal referrals. And I was going on and on and on. And this lawyer said to me, they're like, look, you have to realize that, I appreciate you're trying to be as much of a lawyer as you can, But law's become also like there's a business aspect of law. And he's like, you're a businessman. So he's like, whatever the obstacle is to being successful in your business, you need to understand what those obstacles are, think them through, and then come up with a game plan to like work around that obstacle. Because that's what you do. And he's like, don't complain about it. He's like, good businessmen, they figure out what the problem is and they figure out how to fix the problem. And then you need to move forward with that. And he's like, the day that you don't want to fix the problem anymore is probably the day that, it's going to be the beginning of the end for your law practice. So anyways, whatever it is, how do you know? There's a lot of trial and error. This is a law practice. It's not a law perfect. So, every day that I come to my law office, I'm learning. I'm trying to be better today than I was tomorrow. So, the alarm goes off at 5:30 and, I get up and I have a zest for life. I have a zest for my law practice and, I just get at it and I work at it. Now, fortunately for me, I've always been lucky for the family I have, the friends that I have, and the people that are my colleagues and associates. Everybody has like, the one thing in life that, provides them a special skill. And that special skill, that the special thing that God gave me was I just been lucky to have the people that are in my life. So my legal assistant, she's the best. The managing partner in my office, he's the greatest. My first lawyer that handled all my law department cases, nobody's better than him. A lawyer that focuses on workers' compensation, my partner, he started with me as a law clerk. We had no room even in my office. His desk and my desk were in the same office. He's a rock star. So anyways, with that, there's no success that any lawyer has. You watch any old time movie or old time TV show, they always show like the lawyer that has his awesome investigator or his awesome, legal assistant, and they're even better than him. Like they show him up, so the lawyer's that good, but like the people around him are even better. Fortunately for me, that's my law practice. So, and I'm lucky that way, but it takes a long time to develop those relationships and nurture them back and forth. And, I think any strong law practice, it's not the building, it's not the furniture, it's not the cases, it's the staff that's for the law firm is what it's all about. And so the ongoing success of our law firm is really based on, are we able to continue to add the best staff that we can possibly bring on and, continue to develop the already, strong core that we have.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. People are the key. So you mentioned it's not a law perfect. So if you're willing, maybe as you look back on building your firm, we'll talk about mistakes. Maybe things that looking back are like, I wish I hadn't done that, or maybe some advice to folks out there, be careful of this, learn from my mistake. And that could be both something you did that maybe you shouldn't have done, or maybe something you wish you had done way earlier than you eventually did it. Can you think of anything there?
I think the number one thing that I wish that I would do differently, I still wish that I would do it today, is, I'm always a little bit wary about like, will I find future success? I was always worried about that at the beginning, and I'm still worried about that to today. And so I'm very, very careful and methodical as far as like making next moves, because I'm always very concerned about overstepping. I'm always concerned about backsliding. So if anything, I think in my career, I've maybe been a little bit too careful, and other firms have, especially national firms, taken more risks, So the other factor is, for me, I advertise my practice, and, all law firms have developed to where they need a business model, but I still feel like it's not a law business, it's a law practice. And so I feel like there's a lot of other firms that financially may do better, but I still feel like I'm in the field of law and I need to help people. And there's certain things that I could do that would maybe be would be much more profitable as a law business that we just don't do. And every time that I see these things happening and I don't do them, I see how other firms are becoming more and more successful. And I know that I'll eventually be upset that that just became the norm of what like law is about. But I still have like an old school feeling about like what law is supposed to be about, because I saw my dad or my grandfather and how they help people. So I still feel like in my mind that's like what needs to be done. But if there's a different person managing what I built here, they'd probably be doing things that are more law business than law practice. But for as long as, I'm in the driver's seat, I feel like people are going to get much better care with me than they're going to get with somebody else. My biggest mistake that I've ever made is, you can't really sell law practice. There's different things that people can sell, phone numbers and websites and other, things. Maybe they could sell that, but like the actual whole law firm, kind of hard to sell. So for a lot of clients that I had over the years, they might have owned like the corner liquor store, but they owned the store. And, they woke up 30, 50 years later, and that corner was like, just like a regular street corner in any old town. But now it's like the main corner of like Main Street, 50 years later. So my attitude is that I would purchase my own law building and house my law practice in it. And then, like when I got to an age where, hey, I woke up and instead of paying rent to a landlord, I paid rent to myself, it would all work out. But the only thing that I didn't consider is they had this thing called COVID, and downtowns in big cities were not places that people came back to work anymore. And now remote work and so on and so forth, even remote courthouses are a thing that I never envisioned, nor could I envision COVID. So financially, it wasn't the greatest thing for me to purchase my own law building to house my practice. But in general, I hope that my clients get the idea that, my firm is here. We own the bricks. No one's pushing us around. We're not going anywhere, which is the reason why, I decided to do that to begin with. And so I'm hopeful that, I'll be around another 20 years and the market will come back. And, but in the current world, that was not one of my better law practice business moves.
I think it's going to come back. I just think that, I really think it's going to come back. Is people need to be around people, and that's the important part. And with everybody virtual and not coming in, I don't know. I like being around people, so I think it's going to come back. But so you sort of touched on something that I do want to ask you about. So, you've seen a lot of change in the law. We're seeing a lot of it now, and it seems to be accelerating the change. As you look out in the future, any predictions of where you think this is going? There's, like you said, bigger players in the PI space. There's, you got Arizona where you've got private equity and non-lawyer owners. You got all sorts of things going on. As you look out, anything that you think's coming our way?
Well, maybe we always lived in an uncertain world, but it just seems like the world that we live in, generally, not just in law, we live in a very uncertain world and uncertain times now. And, we're going through a lot of change. So the first thing about that big change is like, how's AI going to change all of our lives? Like the concept that I said, like, as a lawyer, whoever you are, for most part, you have more of a conservative nature. So you're reluctant to change. There's a lot of lawyers, they're still using paper and pen. So like the world is going to start changing faster, and the law is always on the back end of it as far as keeping up and how law firms are going to keep up and how that's going to work. It's going to be very interesting. In the community that I grew up in, there was like where the big houses were the good looking, the best looking people with the biggest houses, with the best, the best families. In that community, there was a lot of those people where their parents were pharmacists, okay? And they had like the neighborhood pharmacy, and, that's where everybody went to get their prescriptions, and you bought your toothpaste or whatever there. And then over time, that type of pharmacy really doesn't exist anymore. It's all CVS and Walgreens and all these Dunright or whatever. It's all national chains. Okay. And everybody all the parents of these kids that I went to high school with, friends from high school, their parents they were like the pharmacist at like the Walgreens here, the Walgreens there. So I'm just saying is now what's happening in the world, like whether it's Utah or it's Phoenix or it's Washington, D.C., where there's different types of ways where non-owners can have ownership of law practices. I just really don't I don't think people that are at like the ABA and, other bar associations that, like this and they think it's good to provide services. I just really feel like, overall there's a corporate policy for how we dispense like prescriptions now, and that's probably good that there's all that oversight. Maybe when you're doing like one thing like like giving like, heavy medication, but the lawyer really needs to have some independence. And if everybody's ending up working for either, Walgreens or CVS, and that's where you get your legal services from one or the other, like there's just not going to be a lot of independence to that. And if like a lawyer just wants to provide from some free legal, or he wants to be long-winded about something, or he just wants to not bill this hour, I don't know that the corporation is going to be into that. And as a community, I think it's going to be a problem. But anyways, we have a lot of uncertainty in the world, but that path where there's going to be a major consolidation of consumer firms. So in the corporate world, there's been major consolidation over the last, since I got out of law school. And I feel like in the consumer firms, there's going to be a lot of major consolidation, over time. There'll always be people that will, have, spinoffs and, smaller firms. But overall, we're going towards big firms for consumer law and massive firms, 5,000 person firms that are very corporate. I'm not sure that that's great for our society.
Yeah. So in light of that one possible backdrop or the future, what's the vision for your firm as you look out over the next 10, 20 years? What are you looking to do with your firm?
I'm looking to help make sure that the lawyers, my partners and associates here, they have the best education, the best computer support, the best systems available. And we invest a lot of money in our technology here, and we put a lot of resources into technology. So as the world goes into that next phase, that technology, that education, we're going to be there. If we're not on the forefront, we're not going to be in the back front either. We're going to be there as technology grows. And if there becomes consolidation or, what have you, my firm is, we're going to make it. Post-COVID, there was a lot of law firms that closed their doors, and my firm only grew at that time. So I feel like as other firms who have not invested in their technology, not invested in their education, not invested in their people, not invested in, making sure that they're getting jury verdicts and, really helping people and having a strong base of clientele that know that you did right by them and, really want to give back to you by referring friends and family because they know they got good service. As the world goes through that metamorphosis, I really just think naturally my firm is going to grow, and I hope to be in the running with, good lawyers that just have like small practices that just, they spent their whole life practicing law, but they didn't see this hurricane on the horizon coming. And, they just determined that it's like better to be with someone that has the infrastructure, has the technology, has the know-how, and, we could join forces together so I could even do more for clients that come here and even get better results that we're even getting today. It's kind of like where I see my vision going.
Well, that's great, Howard. I think that's a very noble vision, and I think one that will resonate with folks, especially as they sort of see some of these things that you're talking about. So thanks for coming on, man. This has been really, really interesting. It's been fun to hear about your journey, your background, and your lessons that you've learned along the way. So if for anybody out there that wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to find you?
The best way for them to find me is first by calling 312-6-million, which is 312-600-0000. If you want to learn more about me, you can see me at ankinlaw.com, which is ANKINLAW.com. Always here to help. And Jonathan, just want to tell you, you're a great interviewer, and I appreciate you letting me go on even a little bit long here today. But I really enjoyed your questions and enjoyed being with you here today.
Well, thank you very much. And again, thanks for coming on. It's been great.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Founding Partner Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts to stay up to date on the latest episodes. You can also connect with Jonathan on LinkedIn and check out the show notes with links to resources mentioned throughout our discussion by visiting www.lawfirmgc.com. We'll see you next time for more origin stories and insights from successful law firm founders.